Hello and welcome to another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson, and we are still in the midst of the pandemic and still doing our interviews by Zoom. My guest today is the commissioner of, the chair actually, of chair commissioner of the Wisconsin Election Commission, Dean Knudsen. And Dean is, again, one of our most run guests on the show going back since probably we started 1.5 decades ago. So, Dean, welcome to the show.
It's good to be with you again. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, I think you were probably a city councilman at the first time that we had an interview, and then became mayor, and then you were assembly person. So with that, I was just wanted to start with talking about a little bit your work on the election commission, and give us a little background about how the commission started, because I know there was a couple of predecessors to the commission.
Yeah, there were. And if you remember, in 2015, the Republicans in the legislature were extremely unhappy with the Government Accountability Board and their involvement in the John Doe investigation. And as a result, there was a move to replace the GAB. And so I was in the legislature at the time. I was the assembly lead in crafting the bills that established our new elections commission and ethics commission. And I'll tell you, if you've ever been involved in legislation at any level, they say it's like watching sausage being made. There's always a lot of compromise, give and take. The Senate really believed that there should be an even 3-3 split. I was really against it. Well, fast forward a few years, I was out of the legislature. They had a vacancy on the new elections commission. Commissioner King was made an ambassador, a U.S. ambassador. And so there was a vacancy, and I was asked to become a commissioner, and I said I would. So then I found myself living with the statutory framework that we had set up for the new elections commission. And frankly, it really works pretty well. The interesting thing about having the split, for all the people that said that if it's 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, that there'll always be deadlock, really not true. Most of the time, we come to consensus. And part of the thing about it is there are 2, like I'm one of the Republicans appointed by the legislative leaders. So I'm the appointee of the Speaker of the Assembly. And then my Republican counterpart is the appointee of the Senate Majority Leader. And then Commissioner Thompson and Commissioner Jacobs in turn are the appointees of the Democrat leaders in the respective houses. But we have 2 other members that are required to be former clerks, and they're appointed through an interesting process. What we set up there was that the legislative leaders, so for example, the Democrat leaders in the legislature, have to forward at least 3 names to the governor. And oftentimes this means they're forwarding names to the governor of the other party. And then the governor chooses from the 3. So the governor doesn't get to just choose who goes on there, can only choose from the 3 that they forward over. And this has worked really pretty well. And I really have a lot of respect for the role that those clerks played. They bring their wealth of experience because they've run elections before. And, it's an interesting, just the process step of that. It's good. So anyway, I'm no longer the chairman, Jamie. We had a meeting at 4:00. It ended at about 4:05 and elected new officers. So each year in June, or every other year in June, we have a transition. So for 2 years, just before the gubernatorial election each year, one of the Republican members becomes the chair and serves for 2 years. And then each year before the presidential election, one of the Democrats is elected. And so now I am back to being commissioner.
Okay.
for the rest
So
of
I had the title right, but it wasn't.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah. But well, then I can just congratulate you. And I have to say, I only watched one meeting on Zoom, but it was the last one on May 27th that you chaired. And you just did an outstanding job as chair, not understanding the personalities involved and some of what had been some votes before. I wasn't really sure why certain people were jumping in. You had one commissioner who really wanted to make the first motion, and I didn't understand what was so critical about making the motion until I realized that her motion was a little different than what the administration of the staff at the WEC was actually recommending. So,
Yeah.
And one thing that a watcher of that Zoom doesn't get is your thick packet with all the recommendations as well. There's a lot of work that went into that, but why don't we just, I mean, the end result was that absentee ballot requests are going to be mailed pretty much statewide. But I think I want you to first distinguish that from what, like some states like Oregon and Washington, which have, you know, total vote by mail, and that's not what this was about. So.
Yeah, correct. Well, to go back to as the coronavirus pandemic was starting back in March, we had a very important election coming up for all our school board members, county board members, city council members, town board members, judges, all the way up to a Supreme Court judge. So we had, you know, well over 1,000 very important races going on. And it was important for us to go forward with our election on April 7th. And a lot of people said, how could you do that, quote, in the middle of a pandemic? One of my responses to that was, well, here we are. And I think before this is all over, you'll look back at April 7th and understand that we aren't in the middle of the pandemic. We're actually in the early days of the pandemic. And so there were proposals that we should postpone until May 12th. There ultimately in the end was a proposal by the governor to postpone until this next Tuesday in June. But we decided it was important to go ahead. And there was litigation over that went to the state Supreme Court. It went to the US Supreme Court, all in those final days. Ultimately, we did have an election. And here's what we saw. We had massive voter participation, even in the face of the pandemic. We had 75% of the voters used our existing absentee laws, which are pretty flexible. I mean, you can get an absentee ballot a lot of different ways. Most communities you can do in-person early absentee voting. So we have a lot of flexibility. In the end, it was about 75% of the votes were cast by absentee. And that's a phenomenal change. I mean, that was 4 times as many as had ever been done before. I mean, usually we had maybe an 80-20 election where it was 80% in person. And we did that all within the space of a couple of weeks. It wasn't without some hiccups, but it actually ran pretty smoothly, pretty well. So now as we look to the fall, the question has been, all right, what can we learn from that? And I think there were a lot of lessons learned. And not just by us in Wisconsin. The nation watched that, the world watched that. And I think what the media reports at the beginning really told the wrong story. You know, they came with the preconceived idea that, boy, this is a bad idea. Why didn't you just postpone like Ohio did? You know, or why are you going forward? This is a bad idea. And then a few municipalities, Green Bay and Milwaukee, you know, closed 90+% of their polling places and chose to crowd everyone into just a few polling places. This wasn't smart. It wasn't a best practice. Everyone learned from that. But other states have seen now that actually there was no increase in COVID cases afterwards. There was no spike. In fact, we had fewer than our neighboring states. We continue to have fewer than our neighboring states, dramatically fewer than all our neighboring states to this day. And, you know, at the time people said, hey, why don't you just postpone? I mean, I know every county board in the state will be essentially without any members and unable to transact business, and a lot of school boards. But you must be able to just somehow extend the terms of the current members. And I said to them, if you fast forward to November and President Trump was saying, I really don't think it's safe to have this election right now. I think what we'll just do is extend the term of the current incumbent. That won't be a problem, and I'll let you know when it's safe to have this election. Right. People would have gone completely crazy, but they were willing to do it with their county board and town board and city council and school board. Really, when it came down to it, the right thing to do was to have that election.
So now, I just want to clarify, Dean, you did not, the election commission wasn't deciding whether to go forward on April 7th. Ultimately, that's a governor and legislature has to agree on that.
Yeah, we're an administrative board, and we enforce the laws and administer the laws as they're written. And the law is that we'll have an election on April 7th. So that was always pretty simple, except that some of our members definitely moved. They made motions that died 3-3 that we should postpone and that we should do various things. But now we're looking at November. And so the question is, should we send, now that we have more time, it's not just a 2-week crunch this time, we have more time, should we encourage absentee voting? How can we help make it easier and fairer, that it's more equitable statewide, so that, if you're elderly and not computer savvy, so this is one demographic group that we heard from a lot. I have a hard time, so this would be the common comment that we received. The individual says, it's hard for me to upload a picture of my driver's license into a computer website. I just don't have the means to do that, right? Well, so then they have to get a photocopy of their driver's license and either fax it or mail it or drop it off to the clerk. Whereas the demographic that's very used to doing the whole thing on their smartphone, lay your ID on the table, take a picture of it, go to the website. When it says upload the picture, you just navigate to where your photos are and you upload the picture of the ID and you're done in 30 seconds, right? And you've done that same kind of thing many times. But that's not an apples and apples kind of a thing. Some voters have trouble with that. So now that we have more time, we decided we should send an application, a paper application, and a postage paid envelope, business reply mail envelope, so that everybody in the state that hasn't done that before, or I should say hasn't got a current request on file, will get an application. And we're using federal funds that came from the Federal CARES Act, was one of the relief bills passed by Congress, to give federal funding to small businesses and to governments. So the Election Commission got about $7 million from that CARES Act, and we'll be spending a pretty good chunk of that to do this mailing. And I believe in it. I think it has bipartisan support. I think that it's fair to do things uniformly, and we should keep our laws and our access to voting as uniform as possible. And this is one of those ways that we can try to make access to voting absentee more accessible to those folks that might have had trouble with the technology of it all.
Right. And there's a lot of talk about trying to minimize fraud and so forth.
Yeah.
But the other problem, besides minimizing fraud, that we did see in the April election in that 2-week time crunch was, and it was a big number. I don't know the exact, you probably know the exact number, but it was well over 100,000 ballot requests that went unfulfilled. And that was because you had these vagaries of the differences between all these clerk offices and their manpower to be able to respond to requests and so forth. So a lot of people being upset that I requested a ballot and didn't get one. And so How does this help address that, other than the fact we do have a lot more time and these requests
Yep.
are going to be mailed out months in advance instead of days?
Which is a big thing. Well, one thing is we've never had a system where we could actually track the absentee ballot. And now we will be able to, because we'll, for the first time, be incorporating what's called an intelligent mail barcode. It's the little, see if I have mail on my, so like, if you look at these, okay, so what happens is there's information encoded in there of who the sender is, of what the batch is, an individual tracking number for the piece, also the address of the person it's going to, down to their 9-digit zip, plus a couple more, like if there's in an apartment building, it helps narrow it down to like one of a few. And we didn't have that before. In the end, our historical average of absentee ballots requested, and absentee ballots returned usually runs around 90%. And this time it ran around 90%. Now, for the people that say, I never got it, it's very hard for us to know what happened to it. There's sort of three things that may have happened. There could have been clerk error. In other words, they bungled the request somehow and never got it mailed out. There could have been postal service error, and we did document some cases of that. Or it arrived in the mail and it somehow got lost at home. I mean, I'm looking over here and scrambling in a big pile of mail to find you a piece of mail right now, and that happens sometimes. Or it accidentally gets thrown away or whatever, and people just don't realize that it already arrived at their house. They didn't know what they were looking at. And that problem is the worst when for voters that haven't done it before, because it's kind of an odd looking envelope. It's got all kinds of stuff on it. And we try to make it the most user friendly as possible, but the tracking will really help. And so what happened in that is usually your last day to request is Thursday before the election. And frankly, even if they turned it around and got you something out to you in the mail that day, maybe you get it on Saturday, maybe you get it on Monday, probably, right? And there isn't really enough time for you to get it back again. That's the reason we don't usually allow requests after Thursday. But one of the federal judges changed that to allow the request to go one more day. And then he also allowed that, they had to be counted if they came in through Friday the next week, Friday after the election. And then the US Supreme Court said, well, that's fine, but they have to be postmarked by election day. Otherwise, you'd have chaos. And what the US Supreme Court meant by the chaos was, we have election night reporting in Wisconsin. We would have reported who was in the lead on election night and still had people able to vote for 4 more days, call voters, campaign for 4 more days. All this craziness that has never happened anywhere before, and it really doesn't make sense to do. And so, one thing we learned was courts shouldn't get involved in the last few days of an election. They all know it. They almost always say it in their opinion, boy, we're really loath to get involved because we know this is going to cause havoc.
Right.
But then they do it anyway.
So on that note, while we have much more time to request ballots and hopefully people will get them, let's say, so they get the request, and when do you think that those will be mailed? What's the time? Assuming that you can get an agreement. Now, I know the next meeting that you're not going to be chairing, but the discussion is going to be the wording of the cover letter.
Right.
And
so in that meeting, we did come to a couple of conclusions, because the first meeting we talked about this mailing, our staff had been working with the state Department of Administration, who does the mailings for the state, to say, how can we do this? And the answer they got was, this is such a huge mailing, we'll have to mail them out in batches over about 6 to 8 weeks. And we didn't like that answer, because then some people get it before the primary, some people get it after the primary. Again, that's not equity. So what we said instead was, why don't we slow down? Let's take our time on developing the mailing. Why don't we mail it starting right after the August primary? So these are going to go out late August, hopefully, you know, by the first part of September, they've all been mailed. And so it's as uniform as we can make it. And then they'll be processed during September and October. Plenty of time, spreads out the workload. But the other key thing that we're doing that we've never done before is these requests are going to be coming back to the Elections Commission instead of to the local clerk. We're going to hire temps at the Elections Commission in Madison to do just the rote work of opening the envelopes, data entry, no decision making about who gets a ballot and who doesn't. But then once it's all into the computer, then the local clerk will get a message that, hey, you've got a request to review. Then they go in and do the request, look and see whether the photo ID is there and whether they've got residency.
That the $10,000 they were talking about, it would cost to have
Yeah,
somebody.
I mean, I'm not sure that it'll be that, but that's what they put for their estimate, right?
Yeah, it seems kind of light, but yeah.
I think I mentioned that myself, that it seemed kind of light, but you know, it's hard. They tried to use estimates based on your usual direct mail mailing gets a 5% response rate. And of the people that get it, probably 4 out of 5 aren't going to mail it in. They may do it online instead because they'll see it, they read how to do it, and that they have the option to vote in person, absentee, early, and things like that. So it'll be an informative mailing.
So I was going to ask that.
Options. Yeah.
What happens if you know, they get the letter and they want to? Will it be possible for anybody to fill out a request for a ballot and then turn around and vote again, or somehow get a second ballot?
No. So we have tough protections against that. I mean, that's one of the most common questions is, boy, this is just an invitation for fraud. Well, it's pretty difficult to do. You have to provide the ID of the person whose name you're gonna vote. So, I mean, conceivably, Jamie, let's say, you know, that absentee request came, and it came in the name of a family member of yours. So you had your hands on it, and you were going to fill it out. And you also needed to upload their driver's license. Well, maybe you could get access to that too. Well, then when the ballot comes, there's still a signature under penalty of law. You have to sign on there that you are who you are, and you have to have a witness who under penalty of law you're willing to sign. So, I mean, could there be fraud? Sure, but I mean, I don't think that's as significant a concern.
Even when you limit voting to in person, it doesn't eliminate the possibility for fraud, because people could show up in different precincts if they've had previous mailing addresses and so forth. So there's always ways somebody could if they really wanted to, but you're mentioning that there's double and triple checks for trying to minimize that. And like you said, the local clerks are the ones who are going to be sending out the ballot, so they'll know whether they've already sent a ballot.
Exactly. I mean, one of the great strengths of our Wisconsin system is we have 1,850 local clerks that all independently run the election locally. They're as close to the ground as you can get. And in many cases across the state, you know, they know people. It's familiar names, familiar places. Not everywhere, but in a lot of cases, that's it. So, for example, it's not uncommon for local clerks to see something unusual going on and just pick up the phone and say, "Hey, you know, I'm your clerk. What's going on with this?"
Right.
That's not.
I have to ask a question. Watching that meeting, and understanding that this next meeting, thank you for explaining more what happened on May 27th. But the next meeting being June 10th is just a simple cover letter that's going to go with this ballot request. Why is there such, upset and uproar about how it's going to be worded, and why would the letting people know this is not going to be the only way you need to vote? You could still vote in person or pick up your absentee ballot in person.
Yeah.
Why is that so controversial?
Well, I mean, I don't think the idea of a mailing, and stop and think about this. If you were on the board of any organization and your organization had decided that you were going to do an unprecedented thing, you're going to do a mailing to 2.7 million people using quite a bit of money. And your staff is very capable, but there's 6 board members that authorized the expenditure, and some of them thought it would be reasonable to see the actual letter before it gets mailed out. To me, there's nothing controversial about that. I think across the spectrum, that would be a common thing for board members to want to do when you're in a supervisory role. But where we've gotten with this is it's national politics. It's not really Wisconsin politics, it's national politics over the whole idea of absentee voting versus in-person voting. And so just some background for that. The first staff memo that came out when we first discussed that item had language in it that said we should encourage absentee voting. After listening to the commission's discussion, the next staff memo said it's not the role of the commission to encourage any one type of voting. We should educate the voter for all their options and let them choose what works best for them. Now, I like the second language, but some of my colleagues who really, really want there to be more and more mail-in voting, they didn't like that second language at all. And then that same group that didn't like that language wanted us to send the letter without any review of it. So I didn't find that very consistent, but you know, where it is. So you asked me before we got on the air, do you think you'll be able to come to consensus about the language of the letter? Yeah, I do. Because frankly, we have very good staff, but from time to time, we will review things and the commissioners look at it and say, hey, look at that. You know, there's a word that will really be better if that was changed. It will be more understandable, or,
right.
You know, so.
Yeah, there's, more sets of eyes on a document, you end up improving the document. You just do.
Right.
But so the timing is such, though, there seems to be a lot of angst. We have to approve this letter now, because if we wait till June 10th, it'll be just way too late. But you're talking about mailing this in mid to late August after that August primary. That means we got 2.5 months before that's going to happen.
Yeah, no, I don't think it will be too late. And the staff and the people they were consulting about the mailing don't think it's too late either. So I don't think it'll be a problem. I actually have a lot of faith in our ability to come to a consensus. We generally do. Do.
Now, so given that we have time is on our side, because we know this pandemic's not going away, there is going to be greater voting by absentee ballot compared to the previous presidential election, and it's likely to be on the same lines of what the spring election was for the Supreme Court, right?
I'm not certain of that, but I wouldn't be surprised. I think there are some trends at play here, right? So in the early weeks of the pandemic was when sort of the fear and panic was at its highest, right? But we've all lived with this now for a couple of months, and we've learned a lot of things. Just as a side anecdote, we started off, we were going to follow the CDC recommendations. By the time we were done, CDC recommendations for how to run an election, now I call it the Wisconsin way, because they basically looked at what we did and said, yeah, here's what you should do. But just as one anecdote, we decided that we would send out hand sanitizer. Well, there was none, and the state was unable to procure any for us. So I told our administrator, get creative, call distilleries, find somebody that'll make us hand sanitizer. So we actually did that at a point that, Distilleries were just kind of getting into that business, and we created it in big jugs so we could send it out so every polling place would have sanitizer. And we sent gloves and we sent masks, but we sent masking tape. I had a town board member call me up and said, "You guys are just ridiculous. I heard you sending us masking tape. And what good is that going to do?" And I said, that might be the most important thing in that kit before this is all over. Because you got to remember, at that time, the CDC was telling us masks aren't important. Don't wear a mask might actually be harmful. Sanitizing and cleaning surfaces is very important. Okay, about 6 weeks later, it's, hey, wear a mask. And sanitizing the surfaces, it's pretty unlikely that anyone gets it from surfaces, but that's a good idea anyway. So, but the one thing that is everybody knows now is, hey, keeping that distance is pretty important. And that 6-foot distance, that was the point of the tape. Mark off X's where people would stand while they're waiting in line if they need to wait in line. And at the point we did that and sent that out in the early days of April, a lot of people in Wisconsin had never seen tape on the floor before. It wasn't at Menards yet then.
Right.
It wasn't at the checkouts at the stores. It came later after we did that. People have asked me, well, okay, so, and actually they said, you're going to have blood on your hands for holding this election. I've been in politics a long time, Jamie. I mean, I had full page ads taken out in the Journal Sentinel and in the Madison paper, just excoriating me for holding that election. And I mean, with my picture and everything. But if you look at the facts of it, something happened after that election. We flattened out in Wisconsin while Minnesota and our other surrounding states went up. What happened for us, our death toll is half of Wisconsin and Iowa. I mean, it's a third of Illinois on a per capita basis. It's a quarter of Michigan. But the interesting thing is it's half of any of our surrounding states. I mean, our incidence in Wisconsin is so remarkably low compared to our other states that no one can really explain it, which is just the opposite of what they all predicted. I mean, if you'd been watching CNN that night, it was like, well, here's an example of what not to do. This is a disaster what they did in Wisconsin. But actually, one thing we did was we showed everybody statewide how to do distancing, how important it is to follow these best practices. And I mean, I think that was actually helpful. In the weeks after our election, Korea held their national elections. They did it same way we did. Have people go to the polls, have them keep their distance. I mean, I think that's what's going to happen.
What would be your ideal as far as, do you think for a presidential election, the turnout's going to be, 3 times what it was for that April election? So it would make sense, though, to try and replicate to the extent we can the same kind of turnout percentage by method of voting?
Well, it makes sense for each individual voter to decide on their own what's the best and the safest for them. That's really what makes sense. And this is what we've all been going through this, right? I mean, everybody has to decide, am I the one who's going to the grocery store, or am I going to get somebody else to go for me, and so on. And it's the same way here. Do I want to vote absentee? We're going to make that as easy for them as possible. Do I want to go vote early with my clerk at a time that there won't be very many people there? Yeah, that can work too. And you can get a one-to-one person to help you through the process, right? And for some people, going on election day to the polls is going to seem like a big nothing burger because they've been out and about for months at that time, doing all kinds of things, where right. they may encounter a lot more people than they will at their local at
Yeah.
their local.
Hopefully people will have 5 months experience of wearing masks everywhere they go. So how about the deadline for getting those in? Because that was the big controversy with, as you mentioned earlier, about the April election is, extending the deadline for when they could be mailed in and postmarked and so forth. So what are going to be the important deadlines?
Well, okay, so first of all, forget the deadline. The time for action is right now. So everybody who's listening to this should go to the myvote.wi.gov website, myvote.wi.gov. When you go there, it's very simple to see what your status is as far as, are you registered? Where would you vote? How would you contact your clerk if you had a question? And then there's a little button for request an absentee ballot. When you click that, if you already have your photo ID on file because you've done this once before, some way in the years since we had photo ID, then it's very simple. And you can request for all the elections the rest of the year, which in this case there's 2 more, August primary and November general presidential, and all the legislative races. You can do that right now, and it'll be done. You don't have to wait for a mailing or anything.
Oh, if a person does that now, and then a week before either the primary or let's wait till October, and you don't have your absentee ballot, the week before the election, you requested it 3 months ago, you still haven't received it.
Yeah.
Or you missed it in the mail.
Okay, so under our current system, you could go on that same website and it'll show that your request has been received and it's being processed, and then it will show that your ballot has been mailed. And that was the extent of our sophistication in the past. But with this new barcoding, there will be some additional tracking available whereas it gets mailed, and that's still in development. But we're pretty confident we'll be able to develop that and have that rolled out by these next elections. And then you'll actually be able to see, what happened with my ballot. It arrived at the St. Paul sorting facility. It's out for delivery in Hudson or whatever, and shows that it was actually delivered, on August. Usually they're ready about 3 weeks before the election. So in some cases,
as with anything that's new, any kind of new procedures, there's going to be a lot of false information out there. So people are going, some people will be either believe it or be told that they, if they requested an absentee ballot, that disqualifies them from changing their mind and voting early in person or voting in person on election day. True or false?
Well, you can't do both, but your clerk can have you vote in person on election day, even though you had requested an absentee, even if you had received it and you just decided you didn't want to do it. Or here's another thing you can do. You can fill it out and you can hand deliver it to your polling place. This is what I did the last time because I turned out that I didn't get it in the mail. And so on election day, I just drove over and, now they have the people outside that are helping to maintain the spacing and so on. This is kind of one of our new innovations, but there's almost always somebody outside to be a greeter. Outside is less of a problem for transmission of coronavirus than inside. So the more we can keep people outside, if the weather is cooperative, that's nice. But anyway, there will be drop boxes. Many places will have a drop box. Or you can just hand deliver it to your polling place. But if you choose to vote in person, you can go there and just explain what's going on. And, everybody gets marked on the poll book. When an absentee has been received by the clerk, they know whether they've already got one in your not. So no one's going to vote twice. There won't be any voting twice. But no one it's not like you get robbed of your right to vote because something went wrong in the mail. The worst, that no one's disenfranchised because of that. They may be inconvenienced because of it, or they may have to go through the in-person voting when they really didn't choose that during the pandemic. So that can be more than an inconvenience. It might seem threatening to them, but but they would still get to vote.
But they're not going to be prosecuted for voter fraud for requesting a ballot, even receiving a ballot, but then changing their mind and voting in person early or on the day of the election.
Correct. Right.
All right. Very good.
Correct. Yeah.
Anything else? Do you see, assuming that you guys can come to consensus on the cover letter, and once that's mailed, is the Election Commission's work done then for 2020?
Well, we still have to administer these elections. And, so usually that's the biggest thing happening in the 4-year cycle is, hey, we got a presidential election, because that brings out the most voters. The occasional voters tend to vote in the presidential. And as you know, we're a battleground state, a lot of attention on us. Last time we had a statewide recount, it was very, very close. Actually, many of our recent elections, in 2000, it was very close. In 2004, it was very close. We've had a lot of close elections, and no one knows how it turns out. But administering that election is still, a prime focus. The other thing is, when I first joined the commission, I thought it was going to be kind of a sleepy job. But at my very first meeting, there was discussion about Russian hacking of state election databases. And well, we had been told that, there hadn't been any of that in Wisconsin. Then they came and said, well, actually, we found that there was an attempted penetration at the Department of Workforce Development that wasn't even the Elections Commission. But now we realize those hackers were the same hackers that were trying to get into all the other election systems. So we think that was an attempted penetration. They were trying to kind of probe the state's defenses. Well, anyway, that was my first meeting. So then it was all about Russian hacking and foreign interference in elections, and what can we do to establish election security. And we've spent a lot of time on that, lots of improvements to our state processes, to local processes. And we kind of put it on the back burner, but again, there was a federal grant of about, I think it's $6 or $7 million for that one too, that we've put on the back burner, but we're also going to be deciding how to spend that money at our next meeting. So our meeting on June 10th, okay, this is the meeting when all the candidates for legislative offices head to, and other offices, like, for example, district attorney, let's say. Okay, well, they all had to circulate their nomination papers, and they were all due this past week, June 1st. And so there are often challenges to those by the opponent, who looks at them and say, you don't have sufficient signatures, or this person doesn't actually live in the district, and so on. I think just legislative races, I think around 400 candidates turned in those nomination papers. And at our next meeting, that's when we go through all the challenges. And sometimes there can be, like dozens of these. We have to have a formal hearing on each one and decide. Give you some background, like 2 years ago, there was a candidate over in eastern Wisconsin who had forged many of the signatures. In some cases, people's names who had never even heard of her. In some cases, vacant lots. And I'm not saying this has never happened before, but it probably was never as egregious as this. And so she was referred for prosecution, was prosecuted, and came to some sort of I don't know how it all ended up. There was a penalty for her, and obviously she wasn't elected. But so that's part of the meeting. We're working on that letter that you were talking about. Plus, we're going to be talking about how to spend this federal grant money that has to do with election security. And so, yeah, these meetings can be long. I mean, that meeting would have been scheduled to be one of our all-day meetings. Typically, down in Madison, usually at a big room in the Capitol, and start at, say, 10 o'clock and run sometimes till 4 or 5 o'clock. So these are pretty long days when we have a big meeting. This time I tried to find a room where we could do kind of a hybrid of Zoom and in person, but the Capitol's not open for any in-person meetings yet. The Department of Administration's not ready for
Has
that.
meeting by Zoom, has that hampered the commission at all?
Well, I mean, so in one way, I think we almost have more, we may have more viewership at times this way. Maybe that's a speculation on my part, but because, you know, our meetings are broadcast on Wisconsin Eye, if it's a full-fledged meeting. But we started doing Zoom meetings, and at first we had a Zoom account where we could have, I think, 250 or 300 people could be spectators, and one of the very first ones, I mean, it was full. The meeting hadn't even started yet, and there were no more spots left for people to watch. And so, you know, but what I don't, you know, I've run a lot of meetings because not in the legislature. I never ran a meeting in the legislature all my time there, because freshmen aren't committee chairs. And then I went directly from that to a spot on the Joint Finance Committee for the next 2 terms. And if you're on Joint Finance in the Assembly, you don't get to chair a committee. And I never chaired a committee in the legislature, but I certainly have in local government and other places. So I've chaired a lot of meetings. You know, one of the jobs of the chair is to kind of watch what's going on. People, you can tell when somebody wants to speak or is ready to speak, would like to be recognized. And you kind of see it when you're in person. It's different on Zoom. You have to be listening closely. You can hear them kind of clear their throat or do something. You're trying to recognize them sometimes by their voice. So it's sort of like, okay, 2 people say they want the attention. 2 people say, Mr. Chairman. All right, well, you got to recognize one of them. Right. And you know what I mean? Yep. And so that's a little bit of a challenge from my standpoint. I'm sure for the public, it's not the same as going and being there, but we have a tradition of open government in Wisconsin. It's important for us that people can see what's going on. And we've tried to be very transparent. We've had a lot of meetings. I mean, we had so much litigation going on that we had to have meetings to talk about litigation strategy. I mean, sometimes we were having 2 meetings in a day, you know, one in the afternoon, one in the evening, that kind of thing.
Well, I want to just thank you for your service on that and ask you to come back, because it is an important year. Some say one of the more important elections we've had in a long time. And there's a lot of consequences as a result of that. But, you know, you've got a tough job. You're trying to uphold the right to vote, preserve it for as many people, but also maintain the integrity of the election. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm proud of the way the commission has operated through this. There's been some controversy, no doubt. But, you know, that spring election, there's only been one election that had higher voter participation in the history of Wisconsin spring elections going back 100 years. And that was in 2016 when we had, you know, both parties had their presidential primaries. Sanders beat Clinton on the Democrat side. Cruz beat Trump on the Republican side. They were both hotly contested and very much still in question how it was all going to come out when we got to those. Neither side was giving up, and that brought out the biggest turnout ever. But this last election was second. And that's really something, you think about it, in the middle of the pandemic, you know. I mean, a lot of people could have said, hey, and we didn't have any, you know, this time there was really, well, maybe that's controversial to say, but I think the Democratic race was largely over by the time our April 7th election came, right? So there wasn't that as a driver. All we had was all our municipal races and nonpartisan races. So I'm proud of Wisconsin. I mean, I think we have a tradition of voting. We know how important it is. People are pretty engaged in Wisconsin, and we've kind of taken on this mantle of we're a battleground state of, you know, let's be engaged because we could really decide what happens for the nation. And we believe in clean elections where you can trust the result. And I'm confident you're going to be able to trust the result this time too. So, yeah. Thanks for having me.
You bet, Dean. Dean Knudsen, former chair of the Wisconsin Election Commission, but as of 2 hours ago. And but now looking forward, you still have how much longer on your term as commissioner?
Oh boy, might be 3 years because
Okay.
I was just I filled out a remainder and now I got a full term, which I think was a 4-year term.
Very good. And is there a website? Is there like .gov website people can go for the latest developments on these issues that we've been talking about?
Right. So I always encourage people to go to myvote.wi.gov. That's really the best place for for you to find out what's going on, for you to vote and see your voter file. And it's kind of fascinating. You can see going back years which elections you voted in and which elections you didn't. But if you want to follow the goings on with the Elections Commission, it's elections.wi.gov.
Very simple. elections.wi.gov. Very good.
Yep.
Thank you, Dean. And
Thank
thank
you.
you, folks, for watching another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. Make sure you get out there, register to vote, and request those ballots. Thank you.
Thanks.